Hello, welcome to another episode of Square Pegs Podcast. Today we have a special guest and a special episode. Today also Dr. Lexi Hain is co-hosting this podcast with me. Thank you, Lexi, for being with me.
Yeah, happy to be back. Happy to be here in your fancy new digs. Our actual special guest for today, I feel like I'm old news, but we're joined by Dr. Joyce Kamanitz, who's a psychopharmacologist, which is a fancy term for psychiatrists, which I learned today. And she's a fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. And you're going to hear more about her throughout this introduction, how she knows Arash and how she helped kind of kick off this whole movement, whether she knew it or not at the time, but what it's turned out to be.
Thank you, Lexi, for the introduction. Let's get started. Hello, Joyce. Thank you very much for agreeing to spend time with us today. I really appreciate the time you took. And also thank you, Lexi, for agreeing to co-host this podcast with me. Having you here is going to help us really to go deep in certain topics, and I appreciate your time also. How about we start, Joyce, with a little bit of background information on you. If you tell us, I know a little bit of that, like how nonlinear your path has been. Do you know about that, Lexi?
Only a little bit. I know that it was later that you went back to med school.
So okay. maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, and also for our listeners to know you better.
Okay. To start off with, I am from a hick town on the eastern shore of Maryland, and no one else in the world is from there. It's like really isolated. So I go up to college in Boston in the 60s, and it was insane. And I didn't fit in, but at any rate, I got a degree in sociology in 1971. I then wrote computer manuals for 10 years.
It was so cool.
Yeah. It was, at the time, Boston was the hub of where a lot of software and hardware was being developed. In the late 70s, I decided that there wasn't enough redeeming value in doing that. So I went to pharmacy school, and that's where I first went to UConn, finished pharmacy school in 1983, and then less than a year later started medical school. So I was at that point 35 years old. So then
when you started or when you finished?
When I started.
Okay.
You can just imagine what it was like being 35 years old. Well, maybe you can't, Lexi, but
not quite yet.
Yeah, but like I was so old compared to everybody else in the class, but it was interesting. So did medical school, then a residency, 4 years of medical school, then a residency in psychiatry, and opened a private practice in 1992 in psychiatry and practiced for 30 years. So, and I just retired in June.
Congratulations.
Kind of retired. Thank you.
I mean, I know that it was quite impossible to find enough time in your schedule to be able to do this before your retirement. So this is our good luck.
This is my pleasure.
Thank you. That's a very interesting path you took. And I know you very well. Actually, you are the person who initially diagnosed me with ADHD. I don't know what date, but it was about like 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not that my diagnosis matters, but it was interesting that you were maybe the fifth therapist or psychologist that I was seeing at that point. I was going from one to another one to be able to do something about my anxiety/depression. I was feeling that at that point. But you were the first one who told me that I may have ADHD, and I never asked you what made you think that I may have ADHD and how come other people missed it. And so I don't know. I mean, like it's 10 years ago, long time ago, but if you can kind of bring up those memories. And
Sure. Anytime somebody presents to me with a treatment-resistant depression or anxiety, in other words, anyone who's seen multiple different providers, if you will, the question always is in the back of my mind, are we looking at something else? And the something else that I've come to understand is an undiagnosed ADHD. So you had seen several people who didn't make that diagnosis. So that was in my thinking about you. And by the way, it's something I ask everybody. Even if it's the first time I see them, I'll do a screen for attentional issues. So that's how I got to it. You also talked about some common symptoms of ADHD, procrastination, difficulty in forcing yourself to do things. So it kind of was on my radar. As for why other people didn't do that, that's a long discussion about the framework of medicine, the framework of, if you will, education.
Maybe actually it's going to be useful for our listeners if you can tell us a little bit about that, because I suspect there are a lot of people out there that they may be facing a lot of anxiety. I'm not suggesting at all whomever has anxiety probably is related to ADHD, but I think there is some useful information in there for them to understand like how your field, your colleagues generally look at this, and like what are the shortcomings of like their evaluation after
Maybe
years of practice.
A follow-up with that, specifically with adults or people outside of the K-12 education system.
Okay, let me take the first part of that. I think if you think about anxiety and ADHD as a Venn diagram, where, you know, you have a big blob of ADHD and a big blob of anxiety, at some point they intersect. And so the question is, I think that one of the problems that some of my colleagues face is that they don't look at the ADHD blob. They only look at the anxiety blob and they focus in on that. And I think, you know, part of the reason for that is because of how the medical system is set up. We don't have time to think about these things in a more holistic manner. So I think a lot of times what ends up happening is, okay, let's focus on the anxiety and deal with that. And we don't think about the ADHD part. Am I being clear about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really too bad because the anxiety is a fallout of the ADHD. And to Lexi, to address your thoughts, your question, one of the things that always tips me off about an adult with ADHD is if they present with anxiety. Because imagine, here you are, an adult, you've got adult responsibilities, like 55 plates in the air that you're trying to spin all the time. That's going to make you nervous. So the anxiety is really a key. And then if you look a little bit farther to the procrastination, to the impulsivity, you know, the difficulty focusing, hyper-focusing on only stuff you like, you know, all of those other questions come into play. But the anxiety it's you have to look at the anxiety as one piece of possibly many other problems, ADHD being one of them.
I want to make sure that I frame my question clearly. Would just ADHD itself, without anxiety, bother someone to a point that they come to you and say, oh, you know, I have like this attention thing. And again, like aside, without any anxiety experience.
I have never seen that.
Okay, that's what I expected.
In the 30 years. Yeah.
And just let me say, I don't see very many kids. So it's mostly adults. And in fact, the thing that struck me when I first started thinking about ADHD as part of the diagnoses I was considering is that almost to a person, and I've told you this, Arash, almost to a person, once the treatment becomes available, they say, oh, I feel so much calmer. That was so surprising to me. And that's what made me realize you got to think about what is this anxiety coming from and not just think about it as an entity unto itself.
So is it then safe to say that it's not the ADHD characteristics by itself, it is the interaction with the environment and the type of environment and tasks and what they are demanded to deliver every day that may lead to that anxiety problem, and then they come and see you.
Interesting observation. I think that very well may be true. Sorry. Because if you think about people who had ADHD in the hunting-gathering era, it was an advantage in some ways. And so there wouldn't have been anxiety associated with it because it would have been something that would be useful in that environment. But in the environment we find ourselves in now, it's really a problem.
And I want to circle back to something that you mentioned about the time that it takes maybe to kind of piece all of that together.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I'm not sure exactly what to call it, but one of the assumptions when we talk about psychiatry compared to psychology and seeing a psychiatrist or a therapist, a lot of times, when you go to a psychiatrist, you see them for like 10, 15 minutes. And I don't know if that's something, if it's demand or how it's set up. As an outsider, why is it that way with a therapist that we go see them for an hour or so and try and pull apart some of these things?
The main reason for that is how people get paid. Psychiatrists are paid to do medication management. And they are not paid by insurance companies to do any kind of psychotherapeutic intervention. So there's the throughput that's demanded of physicians and APRNs who prescribe medications. That's really what you're experiencing. It's a function of the system dictated by insurance payment.
Wow. I feel like there's so many crossovers there, Arash, when we talk about the education system and kind of all of the flaws that we see in just trying to kind of teach to the masses or things like that, how we can pump people out. And seeing at the highest level, when you have these advanced degrees and you're handling people's well-being, that it's the same sort of external pressures.
It's very, very, very discouraging for physicians who really want to help patients. And I actually think that's most physicians. It's really discouraging. The things that are impinging on performance in medicine are insurance considerations and malpractice considerations. And it's very limiting in terms of taking care of people properly. And I think you have the same kind of analogous problems in education. Funding, making sure that you teach to the two standard deviations away from the mean rather than to everybody who could offer something.
I have it on my list. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on the education and how it appears that it's following the medical model. We're going to spend time on that. But before we finish this conversation, you mentioned something. I want to go back to it. You mentioned that ADHD was an advantage in the hunter-gatherer era. I'm pretty familiar with the literature, but there might be people out there that they have always looked at it as a dysfunction, like a broken brain or logical disease or whatever. So you have the authority now. I mean, do you want to kind of explain it to them why that portrayal of ADHD might not be accurate?
To the ones who think that that your brain is broken?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that you can take any kind of human behavior out of the context of its environment. And I think that's the easy answer to that. In the environment that we have these days, we have certain tasks that we're supposed to do. If someone has ADHD, it's hard for them to focus down on that unless they truly love it. So it's an environmental pressure on a brain that works in a way that's a mismatch.
So how is it supposed to work? Which now there is a mismatch with the current environment and demands.
How is a brain supposed to work?
ADHD brain, yeah. Or it is designed to work originally, or
I don't think the ADHD brain can work effectively in the current environment, where you're supposed to focus down on tasks and you get this project done, boom, boom, boom. I don't think the ADHD brain can
But there was a time that it was advantageous, right?
Yes.
So what was that advantage?
Well, the advantage was if you saw a lion in the woods, you were able to focus on that quickly. And if there was something that you needed to see to be able to help you figure out what to do about the lion, you could do that. You could make the changes really quickly. It was advantageous to do that, to be able to change your focus and to be able to move from one paradigm to the next really fast because survival depended on it.
Yes.
But that's not the case anymore. That advantage is not an advantage anymore.
It's not rewarded. That behavior is not rewarded at this point. Yeah. To that, I would add the risk-taking aptitude that we see frequently in those with ADHD. And I think that is also a distinctive characteristic of those with ADHD, that they have a higher risk tolerance in general. They do a lot of crazy things. I mean, sometimes it's harmful to them. Sometimes it leads to some finding, those random explorations. I mean, they may lead to a design of a tool, or for example, finding a new food source, or one way of surviving undesirable situation that they used to kind of pretty frequently actually face.
I think the risk-taking is definitely characteristic of ADHD. And I think, as we've talked about before, I see that as an issue of dopamine dysregulation. So in other words, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's associated with reward. And so some people would argue that folks who have ADHD don't experience the dopamine as intensely as other people. So something that might get me, who doesn't have ADD, I don't think, that doesn't get me, if some experience makes me feel anxious, that's because my dopamine, my norepinephrine, I'm really attuned to that. But people with ADD are not. So it takes a much higher level of stimulation. And I think that translates into a sense of higher risk. It looks like higher risk to other people, but it doesn't feel like that to the person with ADD. Am I being clear?
Yeah, I experience that every day. I mean, people tell me this is crazy. Yeah. I mean, you're not afraid of doing, I mean, I don't do physically dangerous things anymore, but even
you did,
some
though.
of my,
that's maybe now. That might be the kid factor more so than.
Yeah, you probably observed some of that, Lexi, in the lab when we worked together, right?
Yeah. I hate it. It's the worst.
Interesting.
Is there any vivid memory, Lexi, that you can think of now?
There are so many that were just emotionally scarring in terms of working with you. There's the ones that were more focused around the deadlines. And don't get me wrong, I love procrastination. I think it's an excellent tool. But working on your career award and had to be submitted at 5:00. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I just wanted to die. You wanted to go celebrate after. I was like, I'm going home and I'm going to bed because I feel physically sick. It got in at 4:59, I think. And it had to go through our system. And some parts weren't done. I mean, it all worked out. You got funded. Good job. But watching that happen was one of the worst days. This is the day it was due. We were still revising the main body. And then I'm doing a countdown. And all of a sudden, it's 4:00. And one of the main sections that needs to be written isn't written yet. I think it was maybe the broader impacts.
No, it was the
project summary.
Yeah, project summary.
Yeah, so the thing that's going to get posted on the website that everyone is going to see what this project about wasn't done. And I'm like, it's 4:00. Come 4:45. I'm like, we have 15 minutes. What if something goes wrong? All of these things. This was before I knew that it had to go through our sponsored programs office, and they had to submit it.
And Arash, what were you feeling at 4:45?
I was cruising along. So I was just
exactly.
I knew I've tapped into some higher bandwidth and it's gonna be done. And I mean, I'm now, it's interesting because now that I look back, maybe I needed that level of stimulation.
That's exactly the point I'm making, is that your brain is not sufficiently responsive to dopamine to have made you do that work earlier. That's the point.
And that is a section.
And it could have been done too. So all the other parts, the full meat of it, that was done. it was like you left this thing hanging almost for the rush.
No, let me tell you, because now that this is interesting. It's been a long time. I can look back and maybe read more into that. This is a very important section. I wanted to be in that kind of like high cognitive function stage to be able to write it. That's why I left it to the end, and I wanted to kind of get that again. I don't know, like, is it anxiety kicking in? It's not anxiety. It's just like that dopamine rush. I mean, like, so to kick in and make that bandwidth available to me so I can kind of like work on a section that is very important. I mean, so, and it is all subconscious. It's not that like I made that decision consciously. I planned it out.
But now that you understand that you need more stimulation to get that dopaminergic sensation of let's do this, can you think of a way that you could get that without making Lexi crazy?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. It is hardwired.
I've just gotten better at adapting to it.
Okay, but that makes it hard when somebody has ADHD working with somebody who doesn't.
Yeah, and so we see that every day in many different contexts and environment. Like one being like education system. I mean, like the educator has expectations, and the kid is on another like timeline or whatever. I mean, like that they want things be done certain way, certain time, and I'm not talking about. I'm not legitimizing missing deadlines and things like that. I rarely do that, unless I completely forget about something. But I can see, it's very interesting, this conversation, that I can see that kind of mismatch of the understanding of like how the brain of that person is trying to plan out this task at that moment.
And so I just wonder whether if you realize that you need that kind of painting yourself into a corner to get your creative juices going, would there be a way for you to say, okay, I'm going to paint myself into the corner on Tuesday rather than Friday at 4:45?
I've tried it now.
No.
I cannot fool my brain. It's like so, and you know what? It goes back to what you said. It has some evolutionary traces. So when something is designed to perform certain way, it is bulletproof. It cannot be fooled. It cannot be manipulated by just some ideation or saying, oh, I have this fake deadline that's going to kind of like put me in that. No, I mean, like if it is hardwire encoded like that, it cannot be easily manipulated. It's a hardware, I would say, feature. It's not a software thing that you can quickly kind of like adjust. It's not a belief.
It's interesting to hear that, and I agree with you. It is a hardware feature. But just imagine that the roles were reversed, that Lexi were the boss and you were the student. Can you see how...
I would be extremely frustrated.
Yeah. So in education and in to a lesser extent medicine, but in education, that's a problem. That's a problem for the teacher and for the student. Regardless of which way, who has the ADD and who doesn't. So, this is like, how do you deal with that?
It's when there's that mismatch, how people can really work together effectively.
Yes.
Because it can be, an ideal pairing when you have the creativity and the ideas and the excitement that's there. That's wonderful. When you don't want to maybe pursue those things because someone doesn't see maybe the same benefits that way and they just want results and things on time, and not even on time, but early. I'm thinking about the team creativity study that we're working on and how you can see the benefits of these mixed teams, but at what cost? Kind of if it comes from frustration or mismatches in team dynamics.
I think with all of the smart people who are involved in thinking about this, to you two being representative of that group, you'll come up with a way to think about this. I mean, you have to find a way to integrate all of these characteristics.
Yes.
in a system that doesn't value half of them.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
hypothetically, I mean, like, or in theory, there is a solution for that. It's not that it's cancer. You have to deal with it. There is no way to kind of like do anything about it. I think, again, like we can go back to that original design and say like, okay, Arash's brain is designed to jump into a situation, see something, give you some ideas and disappear. And then like if there are people that are more excited about materializing something, applying something, bringing something to reality, then if again, like in an ideal world, if we have a group that they can work together like that, so they can take it over from here. The problem with that experience that Lexi mentioned was that I was expected to write something. I'm not a writer. I mean, like writing is not that's why I was waiting for that kind of high volume of dopamine to be available to me. So I get stimulated enough to start that writing assignment.
So in thinking about this, if you had to repeat this experience of having to get a grant application in or something, could you recognize, okay, I'm not a good writer. Maybe I'll assign that task to somebody else. I'll shoot the ideas out, but let that person write it and I'll review it.
I have the luxury to do it today. Yes, I am working with a very capable team. Today I have this luxury to do that. I can, in the form of like some short ideas, I can present it and then I can get high quality draft and we quickly turn it out to the final draft.
So the other question I had as I'm listening to this is, if Lexi had said to you, Arash, you're driving me crazy. You're driving me crazy.
I think he's immune to that at this point.
So you said it many times?
Oh, yeah.
So that doesn't register for you anymore.
No, and it goes both ways. It's the struggle.
Okay, well, it was a nice try.
I mean, Lexi was a guest in the first episode of the podcast. She thinks she has dyslexia. She doesn't have a formal diagnosis for that, though, but agree with her 100%. And there are writing assignments. I mean, very recently we were working on a collaborative project, actually, that she was the main author. And it was pulling teeth, I mean, to the last moment. And it took me a couple of reminders that like, oh, we are really getting too close to the deadline. And, but this time, again, after going through this and knowing a lot, I knew that she's gonna do it. I was 100% confident that we are gonna submit that and we are gonna submit a good quality work. What I was worried about, the reason I was sending reminders to her was, is there any way that she can do it with torturing herself less, essentially, without suffering as much? So, and I told her after we submitted that, like that, it might not be that healthy to operate in that high anxiety mode. I don't know if you want to add anything, Lexi, to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing too, where I don't have really the leg to stand on when I say, please don't do that, because every grant I've ever submitted has been on the last day. Granted, mine haven't been at 5 o'clock, but maybe it's at 3 o'clock. And I don't know if some of that is just kind of what I learned. I learned to work in that environment and now I replicate it. And how much of it is that I reach that productivity. I don't want to drag things out for 3 days if in that really high anxiety environment, I can get it done in one.
When I hear this kind of a situation, and people might come to my office and say, I get so anxious when I have to write a paper and, what can you do to help me think about this? You were saying, Arash, that sometimes the hard wiring and the hardware make it hard to make changes. And I think that's true. On the other hand, our brains are pretty plastic. Yes. And we can train ourselves to behave differently. And so I would argue that there is a way to change that kind of behavior by imposing different deadlines on yourself as time passes for this project. And really pay attention to the fact that I don't want to feel anxious at the end of this. And that can be a reason why you make a change. it might not be a great example of how people make change, but it is possible to make change, and your brain can accommodate it. Believe it or not, I can see the two of you are just like, no, that's not going to happen.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that's more on the willingness side to make that change.
Absolutely. We said that on the way.
Yeah, I'm not there yet.
Well, you have to say, what's the cost of the anxiety?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think learning to also live with that anxiety, knowing instead of punishing myself for waiting till that third day, if I know I'm going to wait till that third day, some of that anxiety goes away. You
have to make the commitment to making the change. If it's not obnoxious enough to you to make the change, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to tell you, though, I tried many, many different approaches. Again, like, if there are people out there that they have found ways of like managing this, for example, like there are like different suggestions, like break it into smaller tasks. I mean, like write one paragraph, or don't worry about like your deadline. Only do it now for 5 minutes, or reward yourself immediately with a piece of chocolate, glass of wine. I mean, things like that. There are many, many different
glass of wine for everyone.
There are many different suggestions that some of that I can see that could be helpful for someone who has just like regular responding to emails, things like that. But for the job, for the business that we are in, the demand, I don't think those strategies can really help us to get to that level. Although I have to say that one strategy I found very effective for me to get started with my writing tasks have been a little bit of mindfulness practice for 10 minutes, and then I can start writing a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, responding to 2, 3 of the emails. That has done some magic for me. And very recently I've started doing that. So I don't know what it does, but like I know that, for example, I'm procrastinating. I have to really respond to this email. I have to really submit this kind of like one pager, and I'm not starting that. I said, okay, let's try something. 15 minutes of, for example, meditation, and then I'm going to start writing, and it works. It works magically. So
I think that's great. And I think what's really gratifying to me in watching people change is how creative and individualistic they can be in their solutions to their own problems if given the space to do that.
Yes.
And that's really a wonderful thing to see.
Yes.
So I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
So how do you kind of manage that when it is so individualistic? So putting on, your provider hat of your goal is to help people, but everyone does it differently.
I love that aspect of my work. And the way that I've chosen to do it is to create an environment in the work that I do with people that they feel safe and that they can take some experimental steps and that they can feel like they have a foundation under themselves to do a little bit of thinking about, well, let's try this or let's try that. I give them the space. And that's what's really great. It's almost like being a mom and watching your kid grow. That's how I think about it. So it's not like I have all the answers, because I don't. I actually have respect for people's autonomy and creativity in that way, that they'll come up with some answers if given the time and maybe a little bit of help. But the answers are inside of people.
Yes.
They are.
I 100% agree with you. Yes. And I remember even like when you formalized your diagnosis after like the evaluations and everything, I remember I asked you, I mean, it's not that exactly I asked this question, but I asked something about, should I start now taking any medication or not? And I remember you were just like super relaxed. Like, yeah, that can be an option, but I want you to kind of like educate yourself a little bit more on this. You gave me a list of like 2-3 books that I immediately ordered on Amazon, and they helped me a lot actually. And those books were pretty good because they hinted at the strengths or unique assets and that started all of this work. That like, oh, let's look at their strengths. Actually, let's change the narrative from deficit to strength. And I can imagine if I was a young adult or a kid, the diagnosis is done, a prescription is written, and then you go home and you just internalize the problems. And okay, you were identified to have a broken brain of some sort, and like this is the medication you take to fix that issue. And that narrative is going to stay with you. And I've talked to a lot of students in the past few years that they were diagnosed early as a teenager or young adult, and they never kind of like, they were not told that you can actually learn more about this before you take any medication. I'm not against or pro, I mean, like medication. I'm just like saying that, like, I don't think if other providers, they take it as far as you took it at that point.
Thank you. I like to, again, I think it's really important to be respectful of, from my point of view, of a patient's capabilities and give them the information, give them the data, and let that person, let's see where it takes you. It's not my either responsibility or it's not my place to say, do it this way. It's just not. You have to find a way. And again, I think one of the problems with medicine these days is that doctors, providers, whatever you want to call us, we don't take the time to know who we're dealing with. It's, you're here for this, boom, take this medicine, boom, you're out of my face. And that's what the system is demanding. And you just can't, to me, you can't really help people under those circumstances in a proper way.
And particularly when you mention kind of those books and hearing about the strengths as well. I'm sure when people come to see you, they're not talking about all of the good things or the strengths. Arash, of course, you know through everyone that you've talked to, with a strength-based approach, we're never saying that there aren't challenges. Of course there's challenges. But being able to kind of look past that too and see the full individual and not just, here's your depression, here's a pill for depression, you're fixed, right? And to see it as a whole person is something really important that I think a lot of other providers, like you said, maybe don't have time for.
I think doctors, I'll just speak for doctors, I think doctors want to do that. I think it's one of the frustrations in medicine that we're just not permitted sometimes by the system to take the time that's necessary to do the nurturing we should be doing.
You operated under the same constraints, though, but you did it.
I didn't operate under the same constraints. I did not take insurance. So, you know, I mean, that sounds mundane, but I didn't have to see 50 people a day in order to pay my mortgage. I could do it differently, and maybe some people would say that I was selfish to do it that way.
So you really think it's quite impossible to operate the way they're supposed to under the constraints of that system?
I think it is extremely difficult. Extremely difficult.
It's sad.
It is sad. I'll tell you, I know from personal experience, physicians who take the time in the same way that I do to be with their patients in the proper manner that we've been talking about. And then they come home and they have 3 hours of work to do the EMR, electronic medical record, every night. 3 hours of work. I mean, it's just all of those requirements on physicians these days are so onerous. And I think that the people who suffer the most from the system are the patients, number one, and the doctors, number two. It's very sad to me.
What do you think it would take to make that sort of change from largely probably the insurance companies?
Well, my husband and I, my husband's a physician also, we've talked about this a lot. And we think that one part of the solution would be to have one payer system. It's not going to be made perfect, but if you take the profit motive out of the medical field, which it should never be in the first place, to us, we feel like that would be a good first step.
So with all of these challenges, I remember one of the main things that stopped me from going to a therapist sooner was thinking about, insurance and who's going to take that. What can someone, particularly younger adults with all the constraints that they have, what can they do to make sure they get more of this holistic experience? Do you have any kind of suggestions for them?
I do. I always have suggestions. I think that, number one, if you can find friends who have had good experiences with a provider, use that recommendation. Mm-hmm. And it might not be particularly helpful because a lot of times young adults can't afford to go out of network and all that sort of thing. But what's really I'm thinking is the best way for people to get help under these circumstances, and not for the medication part, but for the other part, for the understanding part, listen to this podcast. Seriously. Yeah, listen to people who are talking about these things.
That's what
because
I was thinking
you have
about.
lived it.
I think the information, if they look for it, they will find it.
That's right.
Because the books you suggested to me, they were like $12 each. I mean, $11. It wasn't like a crazy thing that is only in the library of Harvard Medical School. It was just like a solid self-help book type thing. So maybe that is something that should be considered, because what we think about the approach when we suspect we need to see a person, I mean, is like to find a person, I mean, like go through the medical route from the beginning. I think it should be supplemented by some self-awareness.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. You can't think that the medicine is going to solve everything. Mm-hmm. The medicine gives you the substrate to do the work you need to do. In other words, if your brain was having problems completing a particular task, you take the medicine, you'll do better at completing that task. Mm-hmm. But that's not the whole answer to the problem. It's a lot of the other issues like the anxiety, like the lack of confidence, like difficulty with procrastination. Those things you can get help outside of the doctor-patient relationship if you have to. And this, again, I think awareness of these problems is much higher, considerably higher than it used to be 10 years ago.
One of the things you mentioned is, talking to friends and what works for them. Have you seen that shift in the openness of people being willing to say, oh yeah, I'm struggling with anxiety here, and let me tell my friends about it, my family about it?
Mm-hmm. I think, yes, I have. I've seen more of a willingness. Unfortunately, I think there's still a stigma associated with CNS disorders, central nervous system, but it's better than it used to be. So, yes, it's good. And what's nice is that you young people are much more willing to talk about these things than people of my vintage. There's so many people of my vintage that have, depressions, anxieties, ADD, anything. They won't even look at it. And that's very, very sad to me.
Yeah, just the improvement in the quality of life when you're willing to look at it.
You mentioned this podcast. Thank you. You're so kind not just to mention that, because when I sent you the link that we are doing this, you kindly actually listened to the episodes of it, and we met and you gave me solid feedback on that. And I think it would be very useful to our listeners if you can share some of those with our listener. You listen to multiple episodes related to ADHD, Angela, Catherine, Asia for autism. And tell us, please, a little bit about what you thought when you listened to those. These are very successful people, extremely, very resilient, well articulated. When you listen to them, what was your first impression, first reaction? And then, if that answered any question for you, or it added to your 30 years of knowledge of seeing many, many, many people?
What struck me as I listened to Lexi and the others was how difficult having their neurodiverse brains made life for them. Mm. The lack of confidence, the level of insecurity, the fears, the anxiety. And maybe that's because I'm attuned to thinking about that as a psychiatrist. But it struck me, these are things that everybody talked about. All of your guests talked about. again, from a personal point of view, it made me sad to hear it. Not surprised, but sad. But the other thing that struck me was in listening to them, it was really interesting to note that what helped them was finding a space where they were given the time and effort and support to actually use their brains as however they were without being forced into a rigid mold. That kind of nurturing, that kind of support, as I said to you, is very reminiscent of what a parent gives to his or her kids. And it's also, if you think about how people learn, you learn in the context of mild to moderate stress. People with neurodiverse brains, the environment is too stressful to learn properly. And it's a testament to your resilience and fortitude that you've managed to get so far. But how hard it is. It's so hard. But when you provide them with that space, with mild to moderate stress and the support, look what you've accomplished. It's so great. And I was so impressed with that and struck by the similarity of the approach that you're using and the approach that parents take. And it's the same thing in therapy. That's what we do in therapy. We give you a safe place with mild to moderate stress, and you can just take off from that.
What was the evidence of resilience that you can think about? Like, what are those traits? I mean, like these are survivors of traumatizing system, I call it. I mean, the education system. These are the survivors. I'm a survivor. And I was lucky. It's not that like I'm super special, like I know how to do certain things. It's just like I have this resilience, it seems. Resilience is just like a very nebulous definition. I want to see if you can kind of unpeel that, like define it better, more clearly, how it manifests itself.
I wish that I could define it more clearly, but I'm sure the people who study this would say it's composed of this, and this. I don't feel like I have that much of an understanding, but I know it when I see it. And it's people who have succeeded despite very, very difficult circumstances. And they have resilience. They have the willpower, persistence. I don't know what else to say. I don't know how else.
Chicken and egg problem here? I mean, like, are they resilient because they went through that and they survived and they learned how to survive, or?
I don't think so. I think it's an inherent quality. And it's inherent in people's nature or not to have that level of resilience. Now, you can augment your resilience through your experience in life or not, but I think it's kind of what you're born with. And I don't mean for that to sound limiting, because you can build, your brain is plastic enough to get better or to get more the way you want it to be. But like for example, I see a lot of people that have had abusive pasts, and some of them have done really well and some of them have really struggled. And it's really hard to understand why this one is behaving this way.
Is it hard for you to understand that? Like that?
Yes. Yes, it is. I mean, I accept that some people are going to be able to deal with adversity better than other people will be. But I also accept that people can be taught and educated and supported so that they can learn to do better than whatever their baseline might be.
I think that's really important, because I think that's one of our goals here too, is to the people that you're talking to, as you said, they've already reached a lot of those higher levels of achievement. But how can we reach the people that maybe wouldn't get there on their own and show we still have some of those same struggles, but you can do, if you're given that nurturing space. Maybe you haven't had it yet.
I think that having the nurturing space is crucial. And whether it comes from a family, a parent, or a teacher, or a therapist, or whatever, that is really crucial.
That's exactly what I wanted to add, that at the darkest times of my educational experience, there was always that caring teacher, that caring professor. And later on, you mainly played that role. My wife, times my mom, just the idea, it was, and it is so subconscious that's very difficult to kind of explain it in words maybe clearly, but it's just like you feel that like you have a fallback. I mean, like it's not gonna, I mean, the world is not gonna end even if things go wrong drastically. The safest space, the courage that helps you keep going. It is the environment, that kind of like nurturing figure is very important. And you know, a commonality I've found between all of those, that they survive, they make it, they become very successful, is like, if you ask them, they can tell you that, oh, this teacher changed my mind. Like Lexi, I mean, like what was your, I mean, you're sitting here. I mean, like, can you think of like in your educational journey?
Oh, a teacher? Absolutely. I remember my high school English teacher, Mr. Bierman. Shout out. I haven't talked to you in a long time, but was the only person that taught English. So that was the only subject I was not great at. And all the extra time that he would spend with me, and being able to admit that I wasn't good at something and have that be okay, and say, oh, you're good at other things, you know, this aspect of English you are good at, you know, this writing things I can help you with. And I remember telling him, like, when I got my 4 on my AP test, because in my mind I was like, I never have to take English again. But having that person that made it an enjoyable class to go to rather than something painful, when it was something I always avoided. Absolutely.
So the common element here is a nurturing environment, person, teacher, whatever. I think that's really crucial. And let me just say, from the other side of the couch, to find that you can provide that environment, that space for somebody to grow and be successful, that's really fantastic. Yes. That really feels so good for the other person too. Just FYI. You know, it doesn't just go one way.
That's why we are having a blast doing this here.
I'm having a really good time. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Exactly why. That's why,
that's right.
I mean, like, despite our busy schedules, we have carved out this kind of like many hours to just do this, because it's so rewarding.
You know, you just never know sometimes how an interaction that you have with somebody is going to play out in the future. I could not have predicted that what we did together would end up in what you're doing professionally. There's no way I could have predicted that, but look what you've done. You're providing the same kind of space for people. You're paying it forward. Whatever I did for you, you're paying it forward. And man, that's such a great feeling for me to know.
It is interesting you say that, because people that they are nurtured, they're supported like that, they have this tendency to pay forward. Other guests that actually we just had a meeting, and that the person told me that I just want to help others that they may have challenges. I mean, like, so it's just that desire. And I have to say that, like, I really appreciate what they are doing. It is very courageous, because they're exposing that, they're disclosing this very personal thing about themselves. There's still stigma around this. So it takes courage, and you use this courage when you think it is mission critical. It is a very important objective that you're pursuing. And you're absolutely right. I mean, like, if you provide this nurturing environment, the person that comes out of it, it's going to replicate this good. And this is just going to scale up.
I absolutely. And speaking of courage, I've said this a million times to the folks who come in to see me. It takes incredible courage to actually go to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, to admit that you have an issue that you need to address. It is the hardest thing that people can ever do, because it's so threatening and makes you feel so vulnerable. So I always say to people, just think about the courage that it took for you to come in here. And it really is true.
Yeah, that's very important. And I think that, I mean, like, again, like, I've been in your office, And if I am told something like that, immediately is therapeutic for me because it gives me some confidence that I'm striving for at that moment. That like, oh, maybe I can help myself in this situation.
It's funny. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's true.
I always find it's a lot harder to help yourself than it is to help other people.
Well, if you've grown up with a situation where you have a neurodiverse brain, you've also somehow internalized that there's something wrong with you, and maybe I'm not good enough and don't deserve to get help. So overcoming that is hard. Overcoming that self-image is really hard.
And I think helping other people, it really helps with that self-healing too, because when you're able to maybe stand up as an example and say, look what I've done, it helps you believe it.
Yeah.
Like you believe in yourself a lot more when you're
so
given that platform.
It's lovely to hear that.
And listening to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks recently on Eastern philosophies and things like that. And I'm convinced that there is no difference between helping others and helping yourself. They're the same thing. They're absolutely the same thing, both ways.
I think we've been saying that for the past few minutes, actually. Yeah.
It is.
So do something nice today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is, they say that. I mean, for example, if you feel bad, depressed, shitty in the morning, give a big tip when you get your coffee. It immediately makes you feel better. I've done that. It works. It's just so magical.
Right. There was a philosopher in the early 1900s, William James or Henry James, one or the other. I can't remember which one it was. But he said there are 3 rules in life. The first rule is to be kind. The second rule is to be kind. And the third rule is to be kind. And it's really true.
That's very true.
So it helps the other person and it can help you too.
Those people that they think, okay, I'm traumatized, I was treated unfairly, so I'm going to take it on others. They're just harming themselves more.
Absolutely. They're just not getting out of the hole.
Yes.
It's a sad worldview that is not going to change by doing the same thing over and over again.
And it spreads bad in the world rather than spreading good. Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about politics.
Once in a while we touch on that on the podcast. So it's a lovely conversation. I'm really enjoying it. So let's talk about the medical model of I don't think there is a medical model of neurodiversity or how medicine interprets neurodiversity, the 2 standard deviation from the norm problem and all of those consequences of that.
Well, if you're talking about the mainstream medical model at this point, I would say that the interpretation is that neurodiversity is a pain in the ass. And
for who? for the individual?
For the system.
Oh, for the system.
I mean, there are certain people who specialize in dealing with neurodiverse individuals. But for the most part, medicine is not geared to dealing with that. So it's like they don't want to deal with it.
So medicine and education.
Well, yeah. I mean, the goal of the medical model and the goal of the educational model is to educate or treat 1.5 standard deviations from the mean most of the time. And if you fall outside of that, it strains the resources of the system, in my opinion.
For the medical model or the medical field, it is kind of understandable because, for example, with the limited resources, you want to be able to kind of like invest this money to come up with a new drug that can help a larger segment of population, things like that, although it doesn't work even that way. I get that. I mean, like if, for example, you have like $3 million of R&D for like a new drug, I mean, are you just going to spend it on something that's going to cure 5 people or like 500? It's an ethical question. I think most of people, they're going to go with 500. That is kind of understandable, although the way you portrayed that, I think it's not as easy as that. Although for education, I don't understand why they are following the same model.
Because of money, because of resources. The limitation here is resources.
But we are harming ourselves by doing that. We are marginalizing exactly those people that are needed to be able to come up with transformative solutions to take us out of this deep hole that we are in.
You are preaching, obviously, to the converted here. We totally agree with you. But, talk to an administrative educational bureaucrat. They don't care about that. Anything transformative. We got to deal with, I have $1 million and I got to educate this class. So they're going to educate the ones in the middle. It's not any different from medicine.
Is the education, isn't the educational mission to look at what the demands of the future are and what kind of minds and brains are, or like mindsets or talents and skills are needed to be able to do that? I mean, like, not, I know, I mean, like, now that I'm saying this, I'm like laughing and say like, maybe not.
Well, that's part of it. There are many competing priorities in education, and you only have a limited amount of resources. So how do you spread that around? Unfortunately, I think the future generally doesn't get very much consideration. Mm-hmm. It's what do you do right now for the main.
From outside, what do you see? I mean, like, you see this, the way the education system is operating. When you look at this black box, mm-hmm. what do you think its priorities?
I think the priorities are educating those people that fall within 1.5 to 2 standard deviations of the mean. I mean, they won't say that out loud because that leaves those other people out of the equation, but that's unfortunately where it's at. I don't say it's right. I'm just saying I think that's what the reality is.
It's just the numbers.
It's, yeah.
Just pumping people through the largest grouping that we can do.
Yeah. I think that's true.
Although I have a comment about this being only resource problem. Mm-hmm. I think it's more of a mindset problem rather than a resource problem, because as Lexi said, it's just like that one teacher having the right attitude. Mm-hmm. Probably your English teacher, Lexi, didn't spend more equipment on you. I mean, it was just like the way he came across, the nurturing approach the person had, the willingness to dedicate some of the attention and time. Yeah.
Time is the big thing.
Time is the issue. How much time are you guys not being compensated for all of the things that you're doing? How much are you doing that's not compensated? I bet it's a lot.
That's a whole other conversation.
Well,
yeah.
Someone who comes to education, if they are coming to education to make money and become rich, they are misguided.
Nobody comes to education, particularly K-12, to get rich. You don't get rich.
I'm not suggesting that they have to starve because of the decision they make. But I mean, I don't think those calculations of like if my every hour of work is compensated like proportionally and things like that, I don't think if that should be the driving, governing kind of equation here. So maybe in business, every hour, for example, you open your business, the number of like employees you have, I mean, like everything, I mean, they should be net positive. I mean, it's a very clear equation, For education, if you decide to become a teacher, a university professor, I think operating under that equation is a little like, it's confusing for me. I'm not saying that, every person like here out there needs to kind of like do some level of self-sacrifice. And I'm sure the majority of educators, they are doing a lot of like self-sacrifice. I mean, like I've observed that a lot of them, and to an unfair level.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah. My concern is that if we constantly say that we have the problem with lack of resources, we may overlook something that is that can be done immediately, which is providing a more nurturing environment, just not calling it a disability.
I think we also need to clarify what age level, though, too, because when we're talking about university professors and then we're talking about K-12, there is so much more flexibility in the university system without the curriculums and all those other factors. So I think
that's true.
In the university system, as educators, we can make a lot of those changes a lot more easily. And
I think that's
oftentimes
true.
Don't.
Everyone has a lot of pressure on himself or herself. You have a reserve of energy and a reserve of resilience, if you will. And if you're always tapping into that and not replenishing it, you're going to get burnt out. So you're right. It's not just an issue of resources. It's an issue of emphasis on what's the right thing to do, what's, emphasis on the future, transforming the future. How do you make that happen? That's hard. That's hard because we're a society that says, now, let's figure it out now. We're going to do right for now. We don't think about the future very much.
So one major issue that is fitting this problem is a blind adoption of the deficit narrative of the medical model by the education, which very comfortably teachers, they consider it as like a cognitive deficit or like dysfunction and look at the names. Again, like medical model is pathologizing everything. I get that. I mean, that's what you do. But I never understood why those terms, they should directly be used, like that deficit terminology, that kind of like deficit-based mindset. And the reason for that is not that it's nice. It's not nice. It is stigmatizing. It's threatening. It erodes the self-confidence of the person.
I think that's evolving in the same way that we talked about younger people these days not feeling the stigma of psychiatric issues as much as your parents did. I think that it's evolving more to be a less stigmatizing situation in education too.
For example, at UConn, we have a center of students with disability. If you have ADHD, you have to go register with them. So essentially, it is when I register with them, I've admitted formally that I'm a disabled person. I never, again, like I was out of education when I was diagnosed, but my research data shows that only 16 to 20% of students with formal diagnosis register with the Center of Students with Disabilities of some sort.
So unfortunately, the institutions haven't recognized what you've recognized, that you have to look upon a diverse way of thinking about things as a positive. They haven't figured that out yet. Otherwise, they'd change the name. So it's, again, I think it's an evolution. If they changed it to Office of Neurodiversity and Creativity, that would be great, But it's going to take listening to podcasts like this for people who haven't been diagnosed or are asking these kinds of questions about themselves. They're going to have to get the answers from somewhere. And I would say you guys are leading the field in that.
Maybe that can be your retirement gig. You've got the credentials for this.
Doing what?
A cross-country tour saying, do you see the ramifications of this on the people that you want to help?
It would be, I'm rooting for you all. Whatever I can do to help, I'm rooting for you guys because you're the ones that are dealing with this every day. Whatever I can do, I'm happy to do. But
yeah. So I'm silently listening to you, and I really hope that is that way. But what I'm observing doesn't give me enough indications that there is enough willingness to go there. We have communicated that multiple times with our Center of the Student with Disability that like there is a problem here. They don't want to talk about that. again, like I'm criticizing the institutions that I'm hired by.
You're going to have to cut this part out.
No, I think I passed that stage. I'm going to use some of my tenure luxury.
Yes.
To do
Well,
that,
seriously, you've gotten tenure and you've gotten grants to deal with this stuff. Why shouldn't they listen to you?
Oh my God. I mean, I wish it was that easy.
All right. So now that we've kind of switched over and started talking about this crossroads of the medical model and education, it makes me think a lot about impacts of the education system and some of those that led me to, going to therapy and learning about anxiety. And when we talk about those feelings, just jumping back to when Arash and I were talking in the first podcast, those events that stay with you as you go forward, how when you reminisce about the damage of being forced into that box and only looking at the mean and how that comes back and impacts you. When we're trying to get this point across that what the education system is doing is incredibly harmful.
Yes.
How do those two cross over?
The education.
In terms of the medical model in the education system.
Or how the medical model can explain what for example, if you see some situations are triggering that only you can track that to some or multiple experiences throughout 12, 16 years of education.
Well, that's the thing. That's a bunch of thoughts. I think it's the chronic nature of being labeled in a particular way. It's the chronicity itself that's a problem because it makes it inescapable. That kind of feeling there's a certain paradigm that we have in depression. It's called learned helplessness, that you can't fix yourself. And that's a paradigm for depression. So if you have chronically experiencing that, you'll have the symptoms of depression. Now, I think a lot of times in medicine, we don't think about the chronic nature of these sorts of insults. We don't think of it in the same way we think of trauma, for example. Trauma usually is thought of as a big, bad trigger event. But the kind of ways of looking at yourself, what you learn about yourself, what you learn about how to think about the environment from chronic difficulties, as we've been talking about, that can set off the same kind of physiological reactions that you get from a specific traumatic event, one specific traumatic event. So
I've never heard it talked about that way. And basically this system manifesting depression.
What can be a triggering or have any experience that comes close to that?
For me? I mean, I think when it comes back to so many events, when I think about reading, writing, and spelling, I have events at every age level pretty much.
So it got reinforced over and over again. Yeah. That's the problem.
It made me great at memorizing because we played this spelling game in 5th grade where you got to throw this thing in. And the night before, I would just memorize everything. I can't spell any of those words now. I don't have to because of spell check.
Right.
But it was just, I learned that other skill of memorizing.
So this chronic repetition of negative ideas about yourself has an effect. And the effects can be anxiety.
Or being told that you're deficient, you're incapable, you need to be on a special program to be able to survive the system, or
lack of confidence, mistrust of your environment, mistrust of your own opinions.
Yes.
And then anxiety and depression are prominent in that.
So much of it, I do think, comes back to that confidence. And when you erode that from such a young age, how you learn to build that back.
It's, again, a corrective experience, whether it's educational, therapeutic, or family-oriented, is that safe environment with mild to moderate stress. That corrective experience is invaluable.
That actually ties so well into, when we talk about providing students with research experiences that have been in these environments where in school it's like, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. And then you get here and you have this open-ended safe space where you're doing research. I'm just thinking about so many ways to tie, pulling quotes from this, further support from a medical professional and why that safe space matters and why these experiences and the positive research environment for neurodiverse people can help wash away some of those painful experiences over years that have just been reinforced.
From my point of view, when you look at how my primary organ system works, the brain, your brain is going to learn patterns. I mean, it's got patterns of ways of thinking about the world. And if you've been chronically exposed to negativism or disparaging sorts of comments, you're going to have certain ways to look at the world. You're going to feel like you can't fix things. You're going to feel helpless. To me, that's neurobiology. But what's interesting is you can build new neurobiology. That's always possible. And so some of those ways of feeling and behaving can be changed if you give yourself the opportunity to do that. To me, that's the silver lining in this problem.
Is it something that we can, as a blanket suggestion to those that they're listening and thinking, okay, like, what can I do? I mean, like, can we suggest that they look for an environment that gives them some reinforcement, assurance, and like put them in those situations, get involved in activities that they, rather than just coming to classrooms and be reminded that, oh, you're not good at it, this and that, through some extra, and a lot of like people, they may find it through sports and things like that, but like, I think there is more even like more aligned with the academic mission of the institution. For example, like Lexi mentioned that research we found, particularly for those with ADHD, because they get to explore, they get to be themselves.
Right.
They get to really operate under like an unstructured type of system rather than be told that, oh, you solved this problem 9 a.m. this way. They can do things. I mean, like they can stay up even like if they are in that hyper focus mode and like they explore. I mean, like I've seen like a lot of students that they used to skip classes. They used to stay late at one of the experiences we had actually with Lexi was to make sure that they have access to the labs
At night.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It surprised us. It was okay. I mean, like these are the people that they kind of
should have asked me about it. I would have told you.
So I think that would be a good suggestion for our listeners that like if they are, again, like we're assuming that they want to pursue kind of some higher education or at least they want to succeed more. I mean, even K-12, there are opportunities to get involved in activities extracurricular to give them like more. I remember like last episode, Caitlin told us about her experience in the makers space and how it boosted her confidence. I mean, make that trust bridge and like carrying that much load. Probably it was not an essential part of the curriculum, but she took it that far and she gained confidence out of it.
I think that you're raising a really good point of exploring options outside of education. Of course, look for the options inside of education that can be nurturing, but there are other ways also to help yourself. Like we've said before, one of them is listening to podcasts like this. I'm going to suggest a couple of other things that I don't think we've talked about before. Another one is meditation. From a medical point of view, from a non-medical point of view, it does amazing, wonderful things for your brain. So that's something to think about very strongly. Two other things. One of them is exercise. I mean, I'm going to sound like, a cheerleader or something, but I think I know that exercise gives your brain resilience. So it's really important to think about that. And the last thing I would say is to eat a proper diet. Wow. It sounds so basic, but these things are really, really important. And there's a lot of evidence in medicine underneath of all this.
Is amazing because, again, like I had this chronic problem of anxiety. And when I started paying more attention to exactly those three, and it changed my life. I know. And my anxiety level is like at such a low level. that sometimes I have to relearn myself that like, okay, I mean, like, I'm not supposed to be this like chill in this moment. I mean, like, I am going to talk to this many people. I mean, like, I have to feel something. I mean, where is that heart pounding that used to kind of just like shake me at that moment? And I 100% agree with you. Particularly, I think there is something, and I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, but in meditation, that can really help. And what is amazing about that, it is readily available. It doesn't depend on insurance.
How do you get into it, though, as someone who I've been kind of scared to take that step into it because I feel like it's something that you have to either learn how to do, and I don't want to invest the time. I just don't know where to start.
There's a whole bunch of apps you can.
So apps are good.
Apps are great.
Yeah, Waking Up app, for example, is one of the good ones. I have been using that. There are a lot of resources also. There are a lot of like talks you can listen to. Very good teachers.
Because it can get intimidating when there's so much out there.
I think that one of the things that you could consider if you have trouble shutting your brain down enough to meditate is do an active meditation. Do one where you're walking and just let your mind be. That is a perfectly acceptable form of meditation. So I think there's lots of ways to do it. Don't think that there's one right or one wrong way.
That's really good to hear because I always feel like there's a way to do it.
There's not. There's a zillion ways to do it. There's a zillion ways to do it. Experiment a little bit and find one that works for you. But it's definitely something that there are very good data looking at the positive effects of meditation on your brain.
Yes.
Very good.
Again, like my experience is firsthand and one data point, but nothing transformed my life the way that meditation, because, and it is such an entangled effect of different things. For example, like when I started meditation, I felt that like I have more tendency to be active, and then I have less tendency to eat unhealthy. I was able to drastically cut down the amount of carb and sugar I was using, and like that also helped. And maybe that's a good question for you, given that your expertise is psychopharmacology, so you know the chemistry of brain better than anyone probably in this building. If sugar and carbs, they do, I'm not saying having harmful effect, but given like the nature of ADHD brain, if that kind of like stimulation that they get from that, if it messes up anything with attention, with like.
I'm so glad you asked me this question, because I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's inflammation. When you eat sugar and carbs, basically you're training your body to be inflamed. And when you have any kind of inflammatory process going on, what happens in your brain is that it dysregulates your neurotransmitters. It dysregulates your hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, your fight or flight axis. These become dysregulated with a bad diet and with any kind of inflammation, with chronic stress. Chronic stress will make inflammation worse. So one of the things that I'm really saying underneath this all is that we really need to decrease our inflammation by proper diet, exercise. Meditation can help with that. So
with the inflammation?
Sure. It calms your system down. You don't have a positive feedback loop of inflammation from the periphery sending information to the CNS saying, there's a problem. So the whole thing, it's very involved, but the bottom line is that if you're in an inflamed state through poor diet, no exercise, and chronic stress, your brain isn't working right. Your neurotransmitters aren't working right. Your fight or flight response is always on. So decreasing inflammation is key. And you can do it. You can do it without going to the doctor. Diet and exercise and meditation.
And when you say diet?
Proper diet, a Mediterranean diet. It doesn't have to be anything, crazy or special. Just cut out the carbs, cut out the sugar, limit them. Do it in a reasonable manner. I mean, it's frankly not rocket science. If you just get rid of carbs and sugar, or you decrease them, your inflammatory quotient is going to be much lower. It doesn't have to be a specific diet. it just understand that if you eat that kind of stuff, you're screwing yourself up. You're inflaming yourself all over. And that's just not good for you.
So when you talk about diet, I mean, and you mentioned that Mediterranean is one of the more balanced ones, but is it more on a lifestyle change and like being more aware of the ratios of things you're consuming, or it's just like adhering to one like established type of like those things that they sell ads for and they give you packages of?
It's more of a lifestyle change. It's more of, number one, being aware of what you're putting in your mouth, being aware of the composition of it. I actually used MyFitnessPal, and that lets you figure out the carbs, the protein, the sugars, just to be aware of that to start with. You don't even change anything in the beginning. Just, hey, look at the data.
Yeah.
And then to just follow it. And
again, I don't want to promote any type of diet that's not scientifically.
I'm not saying that. Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that you're doing it. I'm saying, based on what I'm saying, is I have drastically cut down the amount of carbs that I take. So I don't know if it's suggestible, but what I want to say is I have become acutely aware of the moments that I crave something sweet or pasta or bread. And those are the times that I'm either anxious or extremely tired. Mm-hmm. So is there anything there?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I know that it's true that when you're tired, feeling sick, or anxious, you're craving those carbs. So there must be something in the carbs that is assuaging that.
Is it something in the carbs, or your body just needs stimulants?
I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. But I think just the awareness that when you're craving something like that, you need to stop and ask yourself,
yes,
what am I really feeling here? Do I really want this carb that bad, or is there something else going on?
And 99% of the cases for me is something else. Okay.
Right.
Like is that today I had a tough day, or
right,
it's just like many meetings, or something else is going on
right,
in the background. It's just like, okay, so let's pass on this one.
Yes.
And for grad students, I think that's so important, being recently in that zone. There's such the emphasis on the work that you're doing, and it breeds such unhealthy habits that it's then really, really hard to get out of. I was my least healthy, I think, during grad school, and it's been really hard after, 4 years to change some of those bad habits.
That's a really interesting point. I think it's really true that it's hard to include diet and exercise and meditation, no matter what stage of life you're in. When you are in a situation where you're the bottom of the heap, basically, and you don't have a safe position for yourself in your life, I think the pressure is really hard. And I think the pressure on you will give you more anxiety, depression, and less energy, less reserve to eat right and to exercise and meditate. And ironically, it's just at that time when it's so important to do it.
That's when you need it the most.
Right. So I'm encouraging the folks who are listening, try to remember this. Even as hard as it is, give it a whirl anyway. Just try to find a little niche for yourself to do that.
Over the time, it's going to be it's going to change your experience, yes, I'd say, those smaller things.
Yeah. I tell everybody who comes to see me, diet, exercise, and meditation. And how many people listen? What percent of the people do you think listen? Maybe 2, But I say, try it for 3 months, because 3 months gives your...
So you're giving formal, free counseling to...
Free counseling, okay. 3 months, give it a 3-month trial. That is enough time to start changing your neurobiology. You'll start rewiring if you try it consistently, not perfectly, but consistently for that kind of period of time. Just give it a whirl.
I'm a lived example for that.
Yes, you are.
I can say that it worked. And 3 months, yes. And it's interesting. You start seeing the effects of that in as early as 2 weeks. But And I still feel improvement every day. And now it's getting to other things. For example, like clarity. I see things are more clear to me. I mean, it was just a lot of like try and error and cluttered like view or misunderstanding of different situations. Now it's more clarity. I am finding myself acting when action is needed and not doing much when action is not warranted. I used to be just so impulsive and just jumping. I mean, like every email, boom, boom. I mean, like I have to be on it. I mean, like it doesn't matter if it's for 6 months ago, 6 months later, or like it's an immediate, like something is burning. So I totally agree with you. And it is very important that for those that they are experiencing anxiety, depression, for any reason, it doesn't need to be necessarily related to experiences as a neurodiverse person. You can help yourself immediately. Not worrying about what your insurance allows you to do, or
that's right. Yes, if you go look on Google, and you'll find out some answers that will probably be very helpful. You don't have to go into the medical system. You can start the effort outside of that. That's fine.
I'm very happy that we got to talk about this so extensively. I think this is very important for our listeners out there. I'm mindful of your time, and I don't want to keep you too long here. There's one more question I want to ask you. I mean, this is not the last one, though. One major point we want to kind of like talk about is if you imagine an ideal medical system related to mental health, how that looks like. I mean, don't worry about insurance or things like that. The way patient-doctor dynamic needs to change, or...
Somehow, I think there needs to be a different concept of time spent with a person. And the person, I wish that the medical system had not divided up all of the body into different parts. So, like a gastroenterologist will only look at the GI system. And a neurologist will only look at
more holistic approach.
Right. I wish there were a more holistic approach. I just feel like there's not very much of a place for that, unfortunately, in medicine these days. I think the closest we come to it is in family practice. They do tend to take more time and, look at folks from a more holistic point of view. I think in our field, in psychiatry, I wish that we could do that. I wish more people would do it.
What percentage of your colleagues do you think they're suggest meditation, exercise, diet when they see patients?
Being optimistic, I would say maybe 25%.
Oh, wow, that's so low.
But being realistic, maybe about 10%, which is sad.
That's really surprising, seeing as, there's no medication that can do those things.
Well, aren't we in the medication business? People, part of the problem is that even if you tell people to do these things, nobody does it except you, Arash, but nobody does it. So after a while, you stop saying it. But it's possible that in primary care, they're saying this more than in psychiatry. I don't think psychiatry, I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that a lot of psychiatrists are so much aware of this whole notion of inflammation and how it affects your brain and some of the ways you can reduce that.
Thank you, Joyce. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you the last two questions that I ask every guest. But before that, Lexi, is there anything that you want to talk about or ask, Joyce?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot.
Feels like we did.
I know. Now I'm
right. Good.
I'm already thinking about, this has reinvigorated me to learn how to meditate and do that. I was working on portion control for a while, which that's still good. But now just increasing that, protein and veggies and some of those Mediterranean things. I feel like it's just like a self-help session for myself.
Good.
That's what we talked about.
Yeah.
Good.
That's what we talked about. I mean, there is
I'm
no line
excited
between
for it.
self-help and helping others.
Yeah.
My first question is, closing question is, what would be your suggestion, a piece of wisdom, advice you want to share with a 12-year-old, 13-year-old?
That's such a hard age.
Maybe you can think about your 12-year, 13-year-old self.
If I had a 14-year-old patient, I would wish for him to not be so worried about what his peers are thinking. I would wish for him to be thinking in a more confident manner about himself, which would take some time and effort to achieve. I would wish for that. I would wish for those people, if they're having trouble, if they're feeling really crappy, confide in your parents or your friends or a safe person. Find somebody to help you. Mm-hmm. That's what I would be saying to kids like that. And in particular at that age, I think the peer validation is so important.
Yeah.
Try to recognize that it's not the be-all and end-all. And the other thing I would suggest, which has been borne out by the Happiness Project at Yale or the Happiness class that they have at Yale, start thinking about helping other people. Put your focus outside of yourself a little bit. And I think that could be very helpful to a young person.
And the second question is identical with the first one, but the age is different now. A college age person. What would your advice be?
Are we talking about neurodiverse?
If you have
anything,
advices that are specific to neurodiverse ones, yes, go for it.
I think that I would suggest educating himself or herself about different ways of thinking about the world rather than a rigid way if you're stuck in an anxious and think there's no other option. So number one, educate yourself. I think you guys, you young people, are so much better at accessing what's available out there than people my age. So I would say access the podcasts, look at the TED Talks, do that to try to help yourself. But I would also suggest the diet, exercise, and meditation. You can do things outside of the medical system that I think are helpful. And finally, I would say don't hesitate to find a good therapist or a good psychiatrist. See what you can do about finding that. It's hard, I know sometimes, but it's worth it. And if you're in a system like a university system, there are often student health services that can be helpful.
Yes.
So talk to your friends, but don't let yourself be stuck in a bad situation.
Thank you very much, Joyce. I really appreciate that you agreed to share your insight and wisdom with us. It was extremely useful. I personally benefited from that. It was assuring, it was heartwarming, and it gave me more energy and confidence that, your stamp of validation that this podcast, the information we are putting out there, could be helpful because you have seen many, many people, you have seen many, many struggles. So if you think this content will be useful to them, I trust you full-heartedly. And at the end, I want to first thank you, WHUS Radio, Yukon's Radio, for generously letting us to use their recording studio. I appreciate their generosity. I want to ask that our listeners subscribe to this podcast so when we release new episodes, they get notified. We are not receiving any advertisement. We are not spending any money to advertise this. So the only way people may know about this is by you guys sharing it with others and encouraging them to share this with others, and also leaving comments, rating us on Apple Podcasts. And we will include the apps and resources that we mentioned in the description of the podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can send email through hello@squarepegspodcast.com. So thank you very much for being with us, and until the next time.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Lexi.
No problem. I got too awkward at the end.